There is a record in the Vedhani Military Archive, Sector 9, Restricted Access, filed under the heading Unclassified Phenomena that describes a battle no one was supposed to survive. Not the enemy. Not the Allied forces. Not the 12 warships that arrived late, already burning, trailing debris like the tails of dying comets. The record is 47 pages long. 46 of those pages are mine. I wrote them in the 3 days following the engagement, during which I did not sleep, did not eat, and apparently developed a habit of talking to myself that my subordinates were too polite to mention until the 4th day. The 47th page was added later. It is a single paragraph. It was written by a human. I will not tell you what it says until the end. What I will tell you is this: before that battle, every species in the contested rim had heard the stories. Humans. The ones from the third rock around a yellow dwarf and a quiet arm of the galaxy no serious strategist had ever bothered to map. The ones who had supposedly walked into the Keth siege at Harova Station with less than a company and walked out with prisoners. The ones whispered about in fleet briefings and dismissed in the next sentence, because the numbers didn't add up, because no verified footage existed, because surely something was being exaggerated. We called them myths. We called them useful propaganda. We called them a convenient story that scared recruits into following orders. The Azara Dominion had been fighting us for 11 years. 11 years of systematic, geometric, rational warfare, the kind of war fought by species who understand that conflict is mathematics, that lives are units, that the correct answer to an unwinnable position is retreat and recalculation. The Dominion understood this. We understood this. Every species that had survived long enough to reach the stars understood this. Then, the humans arrived. And the mathematics stopped working. My name is Kale Varades. I was a strategic operations commander in the Vedhani 3rd Fleet. I am writing this account because my superiors have requested it, because the war is over, and because I am apparently the only officer who spent enough time adjacent to the human unit designated Ferox Company to provide a coherent first-hand record. I want to be honest with you before we begin. I did not like them. Not at first. Not for a long time. I found them loud, confusing, medically implausible, and deeply, structurally unreasonable in ways that I will describe in detail because I think the detail matters. I think the galaxy deserves to understand exactly what it dismissed, exactly what it almost lost, and exactly what it means that a species like this exists at all. The war is over. The Dominion surrendered. There are humans at the peace table. I keep thinking about a scuff mark on the toe of a boot. The account begins in the middle of the second assault on the Vrethus corridor because that is where I encountered them. There was no beginning before that. Not one I was present for. There are 3 parts to what I witnessed. I have tried to tell the truth in all of them. The first time I saw Sergeant Adeyemi, she was on fire. Not metaphorically. The port access corridor of Relay Station Ven 7 was burning ruptured plasma conduit, secondary ignition across the composite paneling, and she was walking through it. Not running. Not the controlled sprint that Vedhani combat doctrine prescribes for high-temperature environments, the one that minimizes exposure time and routes thermal intake away from primary respiratory organs. Walking. One hand trailing along the wall as if checking for a loose panel. Her suit's left shoulder plate was blackened to the point where I could no longer read the designation printed on it. She had a human soldier slung across her back, unconscious or dead, I could not tell from my position, and something that might have been a rifle or might have been a length of sheared conduit gripped in her right hand. She emerged from the fire. She set the other human down. Checked something on its neck with 2 fingers. Apparently found what she was looking for, because she stood back up and turned to look directly at where I was crouching behind the overturned cargo manifold. "You the Vedhani officer," she said. I had been hiding for approximately 14 minutes. I had my sidearm drawn and pointed at the deck plating because pointing it at anything felt presumptuous given the circumstances. The Dominion boarding team had cut our communication 6 minutes after breaching the docking ring, and I had been attempting to calculate the precise probability of personal survival while also filing an internal incident report, which is a habit I developed during my first posting and have never successfully broken. Yes, I said. Good. She looked back at the corridor she'd come through. The fire was retreating now, station suppression finally triggering, foam cascading down the walls in gray sheets. How many of yours are left on deck? I told her 7. She nodded as if I'd told her something mildly interesting about local transit schedules. Okay. We've got 3 active Dominion teams, probably 12 total. They're running standard sweep pattern, which means they're going to double back through cargo in about 4 minutes. She glanced at the unconscious human on the deck. Nowak's going to be fine. Probably. He's concussed. He gets concussed a lot. I looked at Nowak. His head was at an angle that suggested the opposite of fine. There was blood, human blood, which is a color my species associates with mineral-rich soil deposits, which did not help matting the side of his hair into a solid mass. He requires medical attention, I said. Yeah, he knows that. She said it as if Nowak, currently unconscious, was actively aware of his own medical status and was simply choosing to defer it. Where are your 7? I told her. She listened, and, while she listened, she was doing something to the conduit or rifle, field stripping something from the housing and discarding it. Her hands moved without her looking at them. The scuff on the toe of her left boot, deep, 7th or 8th impact at least, caught the emergency lighting and held it. I became very interested in that scuff mark. I focused on it carefully while I tried to determine whether I was going to survive the next 4 minutes. Okay, she said, when I'd finished. Here's what we're going to do. What she described was not in the Vedhani Tactical Manual. I know this because the Vedhani Tactical Manual is 112 volumes and I have read all of them, twice, in the original and in the revised editions, and there is no section titled How to Retake a Relay Station with 7 Frightened Officers, 1 Concussed Human, and insufficient ammunition by using the enemy's own sweep pattern against them. What she described was, in terms of pure tactical structure, not unreasonable. It was misdirection. It was using the shape of the enemy's own procedure as a trap. It was the kind of thing that, if I had read it in a briefing document, I would have flagged as theoretically viable but practically dependent on a level of timing precision that was essentially impossible under live-fire conditions with non-specialist personnel. She described it in about 90 seconds, using her hands, making small adjustment gestures when I looked confused. When I pointed out the timing problem, the gap between the first contact point and the secondary bottleneck was, by my calculations, approximately 9 seconds shorter than required, she said. Yeah, but the first 2 contacts are mine, so that opens it up. You cannot engage 2 separate Dominion teams simultaneously. She looked at me. Her eyes are brown, which I note only because brown is, in Vedhani biology, the color that registers on the thermal spectrum as baseline neutral, no threat, no excitement, which seemed wrong for this moment, were very level. I'm not going to engage them simultaneously, she said. I'm going to make them engage each other. I spent approximately 2 seconds processing this. You're going to make Dominion soldiers shoot at each other. They're running a pincer pattern in a low-visibility environment. If I'm in the right place at the right time, yes. She checked something on her forearm display. This is actually the easier part of the plan. There was a sentence I wrote in my incident report later. I flagged it for review 3 separate times because I wasn't sure if it qualified as tactical observation or personal crisis, that read, the human appeared to consider Dominion crossfire to be the straightforward portion of an operation I could not follow with my full cognitive attention engaged. I stand by it. We did not do the plan perfectly. I want to be clear about that, because I have read the after-action summaries that were assembled from partial station logs and Dominion prisoner debriefs, and they present a picture of clean, sequential execution that is, in my professional assessment, fiction. What actually happened was this: Adeyemi moved into position in a way I could not track. One moment she was beside me, the next the corridor was empty and I was holding very still and trying to breathe only when necessary. My 7 officers were in the secondary junction, armed with whatever they'd managed to recover, in the approximate positions she'd described. Nowak was propped against a wall at the junction's edge, still unconscious, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that I checked 4 times in 2 minutes because his stillness was alarming in a way I could not categorize. The first shot came from the direction of the cargo bay. A single discharge, Dominion pattern, echoing off the station's hard walls in a way that made the direction ambiguous. Then, a second, from what sounded like a different position. Then, not immediately, there was a gap of maybe 3 seconds during which I counted my own heartbeats because I needed to be doing something with my hands that wasn't checking Nowak's breathing again. A burst of Dominion fire that came from 2 directions at once and crossed in the space approximately 8 meters ahead of where I was crouching. I don't know exactly how she did it. The station's internal logs were damaged, and she was not particularly forthcoming when I asked her about it later. What I do know is that when the firing stopped, 2 of the 3 Dominion teams had effectively collapsed their own flanking maneuver, and Adeyemi came back through the junction with a Dominion sidearm she hadn't had before. She handed it to one of my officers. She didn't explain where it came from. My officer held it like it had said something to him. "One team left," she said. "They're going to know something went wrong in about 90 seconds. We need to move." One of my officers, Subcommander Telvran, 22 years in service, for commendations, a person I have known for 11 of those years, said, "How did you later?" she said. "Move." We moved. The 3rd Dominion team was in the command module. This mattered because the command module contained, among other things, the station's communication relay, the navigation override for the docking locks, and 3 Vethani civilian station operators who had been present when the boarding began and had, according to the station logs, locked themselves in the secondary maintenance alcove and had not moved since. It also contained, by Adeyemi's count, 4 Dominion soldiers, one of whom had the heavier frame armor that indicates specialist designation in Dominion ground forces, something I recognized from briefing materials but had not previously encountered in person, because Dominion specialist units are not typically deployed to relay stations, which suggested the station had been assessed as a higher value target than its official designation indicated. I noted this in my internal incident report. I am aware of how this reads. Adeyemi looked at the command module door for approximately 4 seconds. Then, she looked at me. "Is there a secondary access?" I told her, maintenance crawl, accessible from the panel 3 meters down the corridor, requiring a Vethani authentication chip to open. "Do you have one?" I did. "Every command grade officer does." She held out her hand. I gave it to her without quite deciding to. The chip was in her hand and she was moving to the panel before I had finished the thought that I was giving it to her. What she did next took 11 minutes. I know this precisely because I was timing it, because timing things is how I managed the experience of standing in a corridor with a concussed human. Nowak had regained partial consciousness by this point and was sitting up, squinting at the ceiling as if it owed him an apology, while one person attempted to resolve a situation that, by all tactical assessment, should have required a full response team. I counted the sounds I could hear from inside the module. I heard 2 distinct impacts that were not weapons discharge, one that might have been. I heard a Dominion voice, raised, cut off. I heard something that sounded like the ventilation system engaging at an unusual frequency, which I later discovered was Adeyemi redirecting the module's atmosphere management to compress airflow through the secondary duct in a way that temporarily affected the pressure balance in a 2-meter radius, the kind of environmental improvisation that the module's own designers almost certainly did not anticipate. I heard nothing for 2 minutes. Then, the door opened. She was standing in the frame. The command module was intact, all primary systems active, 3 Vethani station operators visible through the door, alive and staring. The 4 Dominion soldiers were restrained. The specialist was in the corner, helmet off, sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has recently been made to reconsider their professional choices. Adeyemi was breathing harder than she had been. That was the only visible change. "Communications are back up," she said. "I sent a priority flag on your fleet's secondary channel. Figured you'd want to do the actual broadcast yourself." She paused. The specialist had a data chip. I didn't look at it. Seemed like something you'd want to handle. She was right. I would want to handle it. I would need to file the appropriate data recovery protocols, log the chain of custody, run the decryption through authorized systems. There was a process. The process existed for reasons. I looked at the data chip sitting on the communications console. I looked at the 4 restrained Dominion soldiers. I looked at the three station operators, who were all looking at Adeyemi with expressions I recognized from the behavioral classification tables I'd studied during cross-species training. It was the expression that the tables labeled acute recalibration response, the biological moment when a witnessed event requires the brain to redraw a category it had previously considered closed. I had seen this expression on alien faces before. I had not previously seen it on my own species' faces. I picked up the data chip and began logging the custody record. "Thank you," I said, and was surprised to find that I meant it without qualification. Gratitude in Vedhani culture is a transactional acknowledgement. You thank someone because they have fulfilled an obligation, or because you are now an obligation to them. This was neither of those things. I was not sure what it was. Adeyemi had already moved to the communications console to help the operators reset the relay protocols. She said, over her shoulder, "Don't thank me yet. That's the easy part." I thought about asking what she meant. I did not, because I was developing a suspicion that the answer would require me to update several of my working assumptions simultaneously, and I had a custody record to complete. The Dominion data chip contained what I had hoped it would not contain, a secondary fleet manifest. Not the routing information we'd been tracking, a different manifest, a second wave, time to follow the boarding team by approximately 9 hours. Second wave. 23 vessels. Our fleet could absorb that. Barely. With repositioning, with the right deployment along the Vrethus corridor's narrow approach, with the communication relay now restored to full function. I was calculating this, running the numbers, flagging the variables, composing the preliminary deployment request, when Nowak appeared at my elbow. He was upright. He was upright and mobile and had apparently decided that the concussion was not, at present, preventing locomotion. He had a field dressing applied to his head at an angle that suggested he had done it himself, one-handed, in the dark, using whatever was available. He had a mug. The mug was producing a smell that registered on at least two of my olfactory receptors as something between chemical solvent and overheated organic matter. "You want some?" he said, gesturing the mug vaguely at me. "What is it?" "Coffee." He said this as if it were self-evident. "Found the station's mess kit. Only takes 10 minutes to make if you know the trick." I looked at the mug. I looked at Nowak's head dressing, which had started to migrate toward his left ear. I looked at the communications console, where Adeyemi was arguing, patiently, with the station operator about the relay frequency allocations in a way that suggested this argument had been ongoing for several minutes and she was fully prepared for it to continue. "The trick," I said carefully, "to making this coffee." "Yeah." Nowak took a sip. His expression did not change. "You have to hold the filter at an angle, otherwise the heating element doesn't make proper contact, and it comes out tasting like," he paused, apparently searching for the right comparative. "Well, like this. But worse." I looked at the mug again. "Does it affect your cognitive function?" I asked, because I was composing a deployment request and I needed the humans to be cognitively functional, and also because this seemed like important medical data given that Nowak currently had a head injury. Nowak considered this question with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. "Not in any way that matters," he said, which was not the answer I was looking for but was, I was beginning to understand, the most honest answer available. I looked at the deployment numbers. 23 vessels. 9 hours. "If I include your unit in the response formation," I said, "I need to know what your engagement capacity is after this." Nowak looked at the back of Adeyemi's head. Something moved across his face, not an expression I could classify yet, something in the register between professional assessment and personal loyalty, which I later came to understand were the same thing when humans were involved. "She's going to want to be at the front of it," he said. "That is not an answer to my question." "Yeah." He took another sip. "I know. I want to describe something that happened in the 3 hours between retaking Ven 7 and the arrival of the Dominion second wave. It is not tactically relevant. I have considered removing it from the record. I have decided not to, because I think it is, in some way I cannot fully quantify, the most important thing I observed." Adeyemi went to the medical bay. Not for herself, her suit's biometric readout, which I had access to as the ranking officer in the joint operation, showed no injuries flagged beyond surface thermal abrasion. She went because the 3 station operators were there. 2 of them were Vethani. One was a Polhari, a different species, shorter, wide lateral eyes, one arm bandaged from a Dominion energy discharge. All 3 had been locked in a maintenance alcove for approximately 6 hours. Adeyemi sat with them. She didn't do anything, specifically. She sat in one of the medical bay's secondary chairs, a chair designed for Vethani proportions, which meant it was wrong for her in several dimensions, and she rearranged herself in it in a way that suggested she'd made peace with this, and she talked to them. About the station. About the relay systems. About whether the coffee in the mess kit tasted the same in their experience or whether she was doing it wrong. Small things. Useless things, tactically. The Polhari operator, whose name I later found in the station manifest as Reth Voahan, was shaking. Not visibly, Polhari shaking manifests as a microvibration in the facial membranes, subtle enough that most non-Polhari wouldn't register it without training. Adeyemi couldn't have known this. She had no cross-species training certification in my records for Polhari physiognomy. And, yet she put her hand on the arm of the Polhari's chair, not on Reth Voahan, not touching, just near, and said, "You did good. Locking down like that. That was the right call." The facial membrane vibration stopped. I watched this from the doorway. I had come to tell Adeyemi the fleet repositioning was confirmed and I needed her unit's deployment preference. I stood in the doorway for approximately 45 seconds before I said anything. Later, Nowak found me standing in the corridor outside the medical bay, and I had been reviewing a section of the deployment manifest and I had apparently been reviewing the same section for several minutes, which was an inefficiency I could not account for through any normal analytical framework. "You okay?" Nowak said. In Vethani professional culture, this question is asked for one of 2 reasons: to assess the fitness of a colleague for continued duty, or as a social formality that requires a positive answer. I understood which one this was. I understood it was genuine. "The deployment window opens in 6 hours, I said. Nowak looked at me for a moment. He had finished the coffee. The mug was still in his hand, and he was turning it slightly, not quite absently, just rotating it. A small unnecessary motion. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He went back to work. I went back to the deployment manifest. I started reading from the beginning instead of from where I'd stopped. I did not examine why. When the Dominion second wave arrived at 0312 station time, it was 14 vessels. Not 23. I had the manifest. I had counted. I had run the projections 3 times. 14. The discrepancy did not make immediate tactical sense, and I was still processing it when the communication relay registered a new incoming signal, not from the Dominion fleet, from behind it, from the direction of the outer corridor approach that our own fleet had not yet had time to occupy. The signal was on a frequency I recognized. Human designation. Not Ferox Company's frequency, a different unit, different encoding structure, flagged in the fleet register as 3rd Expeditionary, Assault Formation. I looked at Adeyemi. She was at the tactical display, running the geometry of the incoming formations. "You knew," I said. She didn't look up. "I sent a message when we got comms back. Before I told you." A small pause. "Sorry. That was the wrong order. I should have told you first. You contacted another human unit without authorization." "Yes. During a fleet operation under Vethani Tactical Command." "Yes." She did look up then. The 9 missing ships are what they peeled off to intercept my message. 3rd Expeditionary flagged the Dominion intercept, gave me the count, so I could adjust the projection. She turned back to the display. "You needed the right numbers to plan with." There was a period of silence in which I attempted to determine whether I was dealing with a disciplinary issue or a tactical asset or something that did not fit neatly into either category. "You understood that the Dominion would intercept the message," I said. "Yes." And, you understood that the intercept would reveal the human fleet's approach vector? Yes. So the message was, you sent the message knowing it would be intercepted. She looked at me again. There was something in her expression that I would later spend considerable time trying to classify and, eventually give up on. The Dominion needed to know Third Expeditionary was coming, she said. They needed to know it and not be sure it was intentional. So they'd split the formation. I thought about the deployment manifest I had been working from. The projections I had filed. The numbers I had given to Fleet Command as our engagement parameters. The numbers I gave Command, I said. All right, she said. 414 ships. Which is what they'll see. I looked at the tactical display. 14 Dominion vessels, closing on the station. Behind them, not visible yet, but, flagged on the relay, something else. Something that had, until 14 minutes ago, been a detachment of human ships that the Dominion thought they had dealt with by intercepting a message. What is Third Expeditionary's combat designation? I asked. Adeyemi's mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something drier and, less performed than that, the expression of someone who has made a bet they were confident about but isn't going to say so until after. Assault formation, she said. They're the ones the fleet sends when the math doesn't work. I looked at the display. I looked at the scuff on her boot, which was catching the tactical readout's blue light. I wrote 3 things in my incident log: the time, the vessel count, and the phrase "the math doesn't work." I wasn't sure why I wrote the last one. I wasn't sure it was a complaint. The display updated. The Dominion's second wave did not have time to reform before Third Expeditionary came in from behind at an angle that suggested someone had spent a great deal of time thinking about angles. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. I will describe what I observed in part 2. What I will say here, at the end of this section, is only this: there was a moment, at minute 12 of the engagement, when I looked away from the tactical display and found Nowak next to me. He had a new mug of coffee. He had made coffee during the opening phase of an active fleet engagement, which I could not assess as anything other than a profound misallocation of attention. He handed it to me. I took it. It tasted the way I expected it to taste, which was not good. The heating element had, apparently, not made proper contact. I drank it anyway. I do not know why. I noted this in the incident log. I noted it under anomalous behavior, which I had discovered was a category with considerably more room in it than I had previously allocated. The tactical display showed the Dominion formation beginning to break. Outside the viewport, in the dark between stars, 14 ships were discovering what it meant to be wrong about where the threat was coming from. I held the mug. I did not put it down. The Dominion broke at minute 38. I know the exact minute because I was logging it, and because the moment a disciplined military formation stops being a formation and becomes a collection of individual ships making individual decisions is something you can see happening on a tactical display before any of the ships seem to realize it themselves. There is a loosening. A hesitation at the edges. The geometry of a coordinated assault becoming, millimeter by millimeter, the geometry of a rout. I have watched formations break before. I have given the orders that broke them. I know what it looks like when the calculation shifts. What I did not know, what I had not, in 21 years of command, ever seen, was what happened in the 7 minutes after the break, when Third Expeditionary Pursuit Formation did not pursue. I checked the display 3 times. Why aren't they? I said, and stopped, because I was talking to Nowak, who had long finished the coffee and was now watching the display with his arms crossed and an expression I was beginning to identify as something is about to happen that I am not going to explain until after. Wait, he said. I waited. I also continued to generate the pursuit angle calculations, because waiting was not a procedure I had a formal protocol for and generating calculations was. At minute 41, the Dominion lead vessel broadcast a ceasefire signal. Not a withdrawal request. Not a repositioning flag. A ceasefire. On the open fleet frequency. Addressed, and, I triple-checked this, to the human tactical channel, not to ours. Adeyemi, at the communications console, accepted it. She accepted it before I had processed that it was a thing one could accept, before I had consulted the applicable protocols, before I had, critically, authorized any such acceptance as the ranking fleet officer present. "Sergeant," I said. "I know," she said. "I'll write it up." "You accepted a Dominion ceasefire transmission without, if I'd waited for authorization, the window would have closed in about 40 seconds. She turned to look at me. "They're talking to us." "Not to your fleet command. To us. That means something." I thought about the 17 Vadhani protocols for handling unsolicited ceasefire transmissions. I thought about the forms I was going to have to file. I thought about the Dominion lead vessel, sitting at the edge of effective firing range, not retreating, not engaging, broadcasting on the human channel as if the human channel were the relevant authority. "Why are they talking to you?" I asked. Adeyemi was quiet for a moment. Not hesitant, she had a specific quality of silence that was, I was learning, not absence of thought but presence of something being decided. "Because they know us," she said finally. "From Horova. From the Pulhari corridor. There are Dominion commanders who've been fighting humans for 3 years. They've built a model of how we operate." A pause. "They figured out we're the ones worth talking to." I looked at the ceasefire signal still cycling on the communications console. I should note, for the formal record, that I had approximately 8 seconds at this point during which I could have overridden the ceasefire acceptance and resumed engagement doctrine as prescribed. 8 seconds. I counted them. I did not override. "What do they want?" I said. "Time." She turned back to the console. "They want to talk. They want to not die." She said it plainly, the way she said most things, as a fact being reported, not a position being advocated. Some of them, anyway. Nowak, who had not moved from beside me, said quietly, "The ones who have been fighting us longest." I wrote that down. I wasn't sure why, at the time. The ceasefire negotiation lasted 6 hours. I was present for all of it, as the ranking Vadhani officer and, because removing myself would have required navigating procedural contradictions I did not have the administrative capacity to resolve quickly. I sat at a secondary console and I took notes. This is the role I had in the discussion. I took very thorough notes. Adeyemi ran it. The Dominion negotiating commander was a vessel captain named Grevthalin. I am transliterating from the fleet broadcast designation, and he was methodical. Trained. Dominion negotiating procedure is based on a principle their strategic doctrine translates roughly as structured concession management. You enter a negotiation knowing exactly what you will give, in what sequence, in exchange for exactly what you require. The structure is the point. The predictability of the structure is what makes Dominion negotiation reliable. Adeyemi did not negotiate structurally. She negotiated by asking questions. Not the questions that Dominion doctrine would have predicted. Not the positional questions, not the resource questions, not the strategic framework questions that would have allowed Grevthalin to locate the conversation within a recognizable process. She asked Grevthalin about the 9 ships. About the crews of the 9 ships that had split off to intercept her message. About what orders those crews had been given and whether those orders had been issued before or after the station boarding team went silent. Grevthalin was quiet for a long time. I noted this. Then, he answered. Not the structured answer, the real one. The 9 ships had been his decision. Not fleet command's. His. He had assessed the message intercept as a potential entrapment signal, he had acted on that assessment against standing orders, and, as a result 9 of his vessels were not in position when 3rd Expeditionary arrived from the wrong direction. He was telling us that the formation collapse was his fault. He was telling a human sergeant this, in a ceasefire negotiation, in front of an open channel that he presumably knew I was logging. I stopped taking notes. Then, I started again. Then, I stopped. I understand, Adeyemi said. She said it in the particular tone of someone who does, in fact, understand, not I sympathize, not I accept this information, but the specific human construction that means I have been in this position and I know what it costs to say it. I do not know how she communicated that with 2 words. I have thought about it many times since. Grevthalin asked, after a pause, "What do you want?" Not what are your terms. Not present your position. What do you want? Adeyemi said, Elaine. I wrote it down. I drew a box around it. I didn't draw boxes around things in my notes. I have no explanation for this. Elaine, Grevthalin repeated. Your fleet pulls back 60,000 units. Leaves the Vrethus corridor open. We don't pursue. She paused. The crews on the 9 ships, the ones who followed your orders, I want them listed as non-combatant recovery. Medical flag. They come out first. There was a silence in which I calculated approximately 11 things, including the strategic value of the corridor, the implications of non-combatant flagging on the Dominion ships, and the probability that Adeyemi had pre-cleared any of this with Vedhani Fleet Command. She had not. I was Fleet Command, here. She had not cleared it with me. Grevthalin said, the corridor is strategic value. I know, she said. That's why I'm asking for it. I'm not going to pretend it's an equal exchange. Another silence. Then, from the Dominion channel, something that was not in the negotiation framework. Something I had to replay twice on the log to confirm I had parsed correctly. Grevthalin said, at Harova. Were you there? Adeyemi said, no. But, you know what happened there. Yes. Then, you know we know what you are. A pause that I measured at 4.3 seconds. We know what you don't stop doing. That is, we have been trying to build a doctrine around that for 3 years. We have not succeeded. I know, she said, for the second time. Different meaning. Both were true. The lane, Grevthalin said. And, the medical flag. That is acceptable. Nowak brought me coffee at the 4-hour mark of the negotiation. I did not ask for it. He appeared at my secondary console, placed a mug at the upper left corner of my workspace, and returned to his position without comment. The mug was from the station's medical bay stores. The coffee was marginally better than the previous attempts, which I suspected meant the heating element had been adjusted. I drank it. I did not stop taking notes. At the 5-hour mark, one of the Vedhani station operators, the younger of the two, a logistics specialist named Vennats whose personnel file I had briefly reviewed during the boarding action, brought me a second mug without being asked. She had apparently learned to operate the mess kit from Nowak. The coffee was the same. She stood near my console for a moment in a way that my professional training told me was not random. Is it going to work? She asked. Meaning the negotiation. Meaning the ceasefire. I considered the standard command response. The one that maintained appropriate uncertainty while conveying appropriate confidence. The one I had given to subordinates approximately 200 times in 21 years. I don't know, I said, because it was true and, because, for reasons I was not entirely analyzing, it seemed like what was wanted. Vennats nodded. She went back to the relay station. She stayed at her post for the remaining 7 hours of the crisis without being asked to, past the end of her shift, past the point at which she had any formal obligation. I noticed this. I wrote it down. I am not sure what category it belongs in. The thing happened at hour 5 of the negotiation, and I want to describe it carefully because I have not described it to anyone else, including my superiors, because I did not know how to include it in the formal record and maintain the appropriate professional tone. Adeyemi stood up from the communications console. She had been seated for 5 hours. The station's chairs are, as I mentioned, proportioned for Vedhani frames. She stood, rolled her neck in a way that produced a sound I associated with structural material under tension, and walked to the viewport. The viewport looks out onto the corridor approach. The Dominion vessels were visible distant lights, mostly, but 3 of the larger ones were close enough to show hull structure. Functional. Intact. Not burning. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. I could see her reflection in the viewport glass. I was not looking at her face. I was looking at the viewport. But the reflection was there, and I looked at it by accident, and I want to note what I saw because it is the thing I keep returning to when I try to understand the rest of this account. She looked tired. Not in the operational sense. Not in the sense that required medical assessment or duty rotation. Tired in the way that belongs to something older than a mission, the specific fatigue of someone who has been doing a necessary thing for a very long time and is not yet finished and knows it and is going to keep going anyway. I had not previously seen this look on someone who was 26 years old. I did not have an immediate category for it. She turned back to the console. "Grevthalin," she said. "Let's finish this." The Dominion fleet withdrew at 0841 station time. The lane was open. The 9 ships with the medical flag came out first, as agreed, their transponders broadcasting the non-combatant code that fleet protocols required both sides to honor. I watched them move through the corridor at the reduced speed the flag required. I counted them on the display. 9. There was a moment, I want to note this, after the 9th ship passed the corridor threshold, when Adeyemi exhaled. One breath. Long. She went back to work. Fleet Command's response arrived 2 hours later. I will summarize, they were not pleased. The ceasefire had not been authorized. The lane concession had not been cleared. The non-combatant flag protocol had been applied without legal review. There were 6 separate procedural violations listed in the preliminary assessment, each of which referenced the relevant section of Vedhani Fleet Doctrine. The communication was addressed to me. I was the ranking officer. The violations were mine by command authority. I sent back a confirmation receipt, which is the procedural response to a preliminary assessment, and I filed the relevant documentation, and I noted all 6 violations in my own incident log, and I did not disagree with any of the assessments on their technical merits. Then, I sent a separate, secondary communication personal channel, not command, to Admiral Tefkaz, who has been my superior for 8 years and who has, in that time, occasionally been willing to have conversations that are not entirely within the formal communication structure. I told her what I had seen. Not the tactical summary. The ceasefire negotiation. The lane. The 9 ships. The way Grevthalin had said we know what you don't stop doing and what that had meant, and what it still meant, and what I thought it suggested about the next phase of the conflict. I told her about the question Adeyemi had asked, not the positional questions, but the questions about the 9 ships' crews, about who gave the orders, about the cost of a decision made under pressure, and how those questions had produced a real answer from a Dominion commander who had every reason to provide only a structured one. I did not use the word irreplaceable. That is a word with specific weight in Vedhani military culture, applied to assets whose loss cannot be offset by replacement. I did not use it in the communication. I used every other word that meant the same thing. Tefkaz acknowledged receipt. She did not respond immediately, which meant she was reading carefully, which is what she does when something is going to change her assessment of a situation. I went back to my notes. Nowak found me in the corridor again. Late, this time, past the point at which the station's environmental systems shifted to the lower light cycle, the Vedhani version of night, which means the overhead panels dim by 30% and the bioluminescent emergency strips along the floor activated low intensity. The corridor looked different in that light. Softer. Wrong for what had been happening in it. Nowak was not carrying coffee, which was a notable absence. Deployment orders came through, he said. Ferox companies being attached to your fleet. Formally. He said this without particular emphasis, as if it were scheduling information. Adeyemi asked me to tell you. She's filing the operational integration paperwork now. She's filing paperwork, I said. She does her own paperwork, he said. Always has. Says if you let someone else file it they get the story wrong. I thought about this. I thought about the 47 pages of incident report I had filed that day. I thought about whether they had the story right. The Dominion said we don't stop, I said. That's how they described it. What you don't stop doing. Nowak was quiet for a moment. He had a habit, I had noticed, of going still when something was being asked rather than stated, a specific quality of attention, not the absence of response but the full presence of it. Yeah, he said. Is that accurate? He considered this with what I had come to recognize as genuine seriousness, not the performed seriousness of someone managing a question they find threatening but the actual consideration of someone who doesn't give dishonest answers. Mostly, he said. Some of us stop. A pause. But, then, someone else picks it up. I wrote that down when I got back to the console. I wrote it under the section of my incident log that I had labeled, somewhat inaccurately, Command Observations. It was not a command observation. I was not sure what it was. I wrote it anyway. There is a concept in Vedhani professional culture, Velathran, that has no direct translation. It describes the state of a strategy that is coherent and correctly executed and loses anyway, not because of failure but because the situation has changed in a way the strategy was not designed to anticipate. Velathran is the rational outcome of operating with incomplete information. It is not a failure state, technically. It is what the doctrine calls an expected variance. We have a grief ritual for it. Brief, formal, less than 3 minutes. You acknowledge the strategy, you acknowledge the change, you begin recalculating. I had performed this ritual, in my career, perhaps 40 times. It covers a significant percentage of outcomes in war. I stood at the viewport at 0300 station time, unable to sleep, which is unusual for me. I have, historically, very reliable sleep architecture, and I thought about whether what I had witnessed over the past 20 hours qualified as Velathran. It did not. Nothing had failed. Nothing had been lost. The corridor was open. The ceasefire was holding. The Dominion's second wave had withdrawn. By every metric I had available, the situation had resolved in our favor. And, yet, the Dominion commander had said, "We have been trying to build a doctrine around that for 3 years. We have not succeeded." I turned that sentence over. I examined it from the positions I had available: strategic, operational, analytical. You can build a doctrine around a capability. You can build a doctrine around a resource, a weapon, a tactical pattern, even an unconventional one. The Dominion had been in this war long enough and was skilled enough to have built doctrine around most things we had thrown at them. They could not build doctrine around not stopping. Not because it was tactically complex. Because it required something: their strategic framework, the beautiful, logical, rational framework that had made them one of the most effective military forces in the contested rim, had no architecture to replicate. You cannot plan for an opponent who is not running the same calculation you are. I thought about the 8 seconds during which I could have overridden the ceasefire acceptance. I thought about the lane. The 9 ships with the medical flag. The question Adeyemi had asked Grevthalin that was not a strategic question at all, but which had produced the real answer. I thought about Vendat staying at her post past the end of her shift. I thought about Nowak making coffee in the middle of a fleet engagement. The viewport showed empty corridor now. Stars. The faint structural lights of the station's docking ring. There was a word I had been reaching for since approximately minute 12 of the first engagement, when I had looked away from the tactical display. A word from the Vedhani technical vocabulary, which is very precise, which has a specific term for almost every condition, situation, and outcome I had encountered in 21 years of service. I could not find it. The closest I could manage was Velathran, but, inverted, not the grief of a strategy that fails because the situation changed, but the disorientation of a strategy that has not failed because you were never the one setting the terms. There is no Vedhani word for that. I wrote, in my incident log, at 0317 station time, there may not be a word for this. I looked at the stars for a while longer. Then, I went back to the deployment planning, because part 3 was coming, and I had been told by Adeyemi very matter-of-factly, over what had been, to my surprise, a genuinely decent cup of coffee at 0200, that the Vrethus corridor was not the end. It was the opening. I had asked what she meant. She had looked at the corridor map on the display with the focused, quiet expression I was learning to recognize as the exterior of something large. The Dominion fleet that broke, she said. They're going back to their command structure. And they're going to report what happened here. What it felt like. A pause. That spreads. I looked at the map. I thought about 14 ships going home. About what they carried. That helps us? I said. She didn't answer right away. She had a habit of not answering rhetorical questions, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she seemed to understand that the question was working something out that didn't need her to finish it. It changes things, she said, finally. She was right. She was right in ways that took me until part 3 to fully understand, and even then, I am not certain I have finished understanding them. But that is the next section. What I will say here, at the end of part 2, is that at 0341 station time, I went to the mess bay and I used the technique Nowak had described, holding the filter at an angle, and I made myself a cup of coffee. It was bad. It was genuinely, structurally bad coffee. The heating element clearly had a fundamental design flaw that no filter angle could fully compensate for. I stood at the counter and drank all of it. I noted this in my log under anomalous behavior, which was a category that had, at this point, grown substantially beyond its original allocation. I did not consider this a problem. That, in itself, I noted as possibly the most anomalous thing of all. The Vrithis command assault began at 0600 on the 43rd day after the ceasefire at Ven 7, and, I want to be honest with you, I did not think it would work. I want to be honest about this because the formal record, which I have also written, documents the operation as a joint Vathani-human tactical success with effective force coordination across multiple engagement zones, and, while that is accurate, it does not convey the specific quality of my disbelief at 0600. Standing at the command display of the VNS Tefkaz, Admiral Tefkaz had given her name to a ship, which is an honor she had refused twice and accepted on the third offer, which I mention only because it seemed relevant to understanding her, looking at the operational scope and thinking, with the precision of 21 years of professional training, this is not survivable. Not for us. Not at this scale. The Dominion Vrithis Command Cluster was the administrative and strategic center of their contested rim operations. 11 defense stations, for capital ships in permanent anchorage, a ground fortification network on the 2 habitable moons of the system's gas giant, and a reactive fleet reserve that our most recent intelligence assessed at 37 vessels, give or take 6, which is a margin of error that represents more ships than most fleets own. Our assault force, 14 Vathani warships, 7 Polhari support vessels, and what the operational manifest listed as human expeditionary element, composite force, TBD. TBD. I had asked Adeyemi, 6 days before the assault, what TBD meant. She had said, we're still working on the list. I had asked when the list would be finalized. She had said, before we get there. This was technically true, and I had documented it as a satisfactory answer in a way that I recognized, even at the time, was not entirely satisfactory. What I had not fully understood, what became clear to me over the 43 days of ceasefire-adjacent maneuvering, information exchange, supply coordination, and what Nowak described as working the problem from every angle simultaneously, was that TBD was not a placeholder. It was a method. The Dominion had not been idle since Ven 7. They understood the corridor was open. They understood what that meant strategically. They had reinforced the command cluster, rotated 2 of the capital ships, upgraded the moon fortifications, and deployed the reactive fleet reserve to a closer anchorage position that, by my calculation, reduced our response window from 11 minutes to 4. They had also, apparently, had a significant number of internal conversations. I know this because Grev Thalin had continued, since the Ven 7 ceasefire, to communicate with Adeyemi on the channel they had used during the negotiation. Not officially, there was no formal channel between a Dominion vessel captain and a human sergeant. Informally. In the gaps. He had sent 17 messages. She had replied to all of them. I had access to this channel because I was the ranking officer in the joint operation and because the station relay logged everything. I want to note that I read all 34 messages. I want to note further that none of them were operationally compromising. I struggled to classify them in the standard log categories. They were conversations about the war. About what it had cost. About the 9 ships. About Harova. About whether the thing they were both inside of could become something other than what it currently was. Grevthalin asked, in his 11th message, what the humans wanted. Not as a negotiating question. As a genuine question. Adeyemi had replied, to finish it. He had written back, finish it how? She had written, alive. Both sides. He had not responded for 2 days. Then, that is not a war aim we have a strategic framework for. She had written, and I copied this into my personal notes for reasons I have still not fully analyzed, I know. That's the problem. The TBD list was finalized at 0430, 90 minutes before assault commencement. It was not what I had been modeling. The human composite force included Ferox Company, 3 additional human infantry units, 2 electronic warfare teams, a human logistics corps that I had not known existed and that had apparently been running parallel supply operations in the outer corridor for the past 3 weeks, and this is the part one want to note carefully, because it does not fit neatly into any category I had available: 12 human diplomatic personnel. 12. In an assault force. I looked at the manifest. I looked at Adeyemi, who was at the tactical display running final coordination checks with the subunit commanders. She had the expression she always had before an operation: focused, quiet, operating the large internal thing behind the exterior, and I did not want to interrupt it, but I needed to ask. Diplomats, I said. Yes, she said. In the assault force. Yes. What? I stopped. Started again. What are they for? She looked at me. She had the particular quality of looking that I had learned, over 43 days, meant she was deciding how much of the explanation I needed versus how much would slow us down. There are Dominion commanders in that system who have been talking to each other since Ven 7, she said. They need someone to talk to. When things start moving, they're going to need a door, not just a choice between fighting and dying. I looked at the manifest again. 12 diplomatic personnel, equipped with communications gear and, inexplicably, a portable translation suite that was more sophisticated than the one aboard my flagship. You planned this at Ven 7, I said. Started planning it, she said. Before the ceasefire was finished. During, she said. Which meant during the 5 hours of negotiation. Which meant that while she was running a ceasefire negotiation with a Dominion fleet commander, she was simultaneously planning the operation that would end the campaign. I wrote this down. I drew another box around it. I do not know when I developed the habit of drawing boxes. I want to describe the first 6 minutes of the assault, because they are the part that exists differently in my memory than in the formal record. The formal record describes initial contact, fire exchange, tactical maneuvering, and the first phase of the defense station suppression sequence. All correct. All accurate. What the formal record does not describe, because it is not the kind of thing that belongs in a formal record, is the silence on the command channel in the 4 seconds before contact. Not operational silence. Not communication discipline. The specific silence of a collection of officers who have looked at the odds and have made a decision about them, not a calculation, not an assessment, the kind of decision that happens in the place below calculation. I was the ranking Vedhani officer. The Tefkaz was the command ship. My name was on the operational authorization. Adeyemi's voice came through on the joint tactical channel. She said, move. One word. No preamble. No speech. They moved. At minute 9, the first Dominion defense station went dark. Not destroyed, dark. All outbound transmissions ceased, all weapon systems went to standby, and the station's docking indicators switched to the approach code that means personnel transfer, non-hostile. The station commander was requesting a boarding action. His own boarding action. He was asking to be boarded. I had no protocol for this. I searched the fleet doctrine database while the engagement was ongoing, running a search that came back with nothing applicable. I asked my tactical officer. My tactical officer had no protocol either. Adeyemi's voice, on the joint channel, Diplomatic Team 1, you're up. I watched, on the tactical display, as a shuttle detached from the human composite element and moved toward the dark station on an approach vector that would have been suicidal 6 minutes ago. The defense station did not fire. By minute 31, 3 stations were dark. By minute 44, 6. The capital ships in permanent anchorage were still active and were conducting a coordinated defensive engagement that was, by all technical assessments, superb. The Dominion does not build poor military infrastructure. But the engagement geometry had changed. Where they had expected to be defending against a concentrated assault, they were instead managing a fragmented situation in which substantial portions of their own defensive network had stopped participating. The Dominion fleet commander, not Grefellin, a different commander, higher rank, the officer in command of the entire Vrethus cluster, broadcast on all channels at minute 47. He said, in the standard translation that our systems rendered in real time, "What are you doing?" He was not asking about the tactical mechanics. I understood this. The tactics were visible. What he was asking was the question underneath: what kind of thing does this, which is not a question for which military doctrine has prepared a response. Adeyemi's voice, on the open channel, the one the Dominion commander had used: "We're ending the war." A silence. "Then, this is not how wars end." "Sometimes it is," she said. Another silence. I measured it at 6.1 seconds, which is, in my professional experience, an extremely long silence from a military commander during an active engagement. It is the length of silence that indicates a framework being revised. "You could destroy us," he said. "The odds, I know the odds," she said. "Then, why?" "Because I want to stop doing this," she said. "And, I think some of you do too." The silence from the Dominion command channel lasted 11 minutes after that exchange. I counted them. I counted other things during those 11 minutes: the status of the remaining active stations, the position of the reactive fleet reserve, which had not yet fully committed, the fuel consumption of the human electronic warfare teams who had been running continuous interference for 41 minutes. Nowak appeared at my station at minute 7. No coffee this time. He stood beside me and watched the display in the specific way he had, fully present, not filling the space. I said, without deciding to say it, "Does she know what she's doing?" He looked at the display for a moment. "Not exactly," he said. "Nobody does, going in." "That's not really the point." I processed this. "What is the point?" "Doing it anyway." The Dominion fleet commander opened the channel again at minute 12. He did not announce a ceasefire. He did not request terms. He said, "I need to speak to the diplomatic element." And that was, in some sense, the end. Not immediately. There were 3 more hours of active maneuvering, one significant exchange involving the moon fortifications that I need to credit primarily to the human electronic warfare teams and their ability to operate in communication environments that would have been impossible for any other force we had access to. There was paperwork, beginning at approximately hour 4, a quantity of paperwork that continues to occupy significant portions of my working day. But, in the sense that matters, in the sense of the decision being made, the balance tipping, the thing becoming irreversible, it was minute 12 of the Vrethus assault. The diplomatic element docked with the Dominion command vessel at 0914. I watched the docking on the tactical display. Then, I watched the display for a while after, because I was not sure what to do with my hands. Adeyemi found me at 11:40. The assault was formally concluded. The documentation was in progress. The diplomatic teams were still aboard the Dominion command vessel, and what they were doing in there would eventually become its own record, a different record from mine, written by people trained to write it. She found me in the Tefkaz observation bay, which has a viewport that runs the full length of the hull's port side, which is not operationally necessary but is, I think, the reason the ship was named after someone who had twice refused to have a ship named after her. I had been standing at the viewport for approximately 20 minutes. I had not been taking notes. Adeyemi stood beside me. She did not say anything immediately. The Vrethus system's gas giant was visible from this angle, large amber and rust in bands, 2 of its moons just visible as dark crescents at the lower edge of the frame. The Dominion command vessel was in the distance, docked with its diplomatic visitors, lights on. I looked at the scuff on her boot. Force of habit, at this point. The ninth scratch was still the deepest. There were 10 now. You thought it wasn't going to work, she said. Yes, I said. But, you authorized it. I thought about how to answer this. I thought about the 8 seconds at Ven 7 and the 80 seconds before assault commencement and the 11 minutes of silence on the Dominion channel and all the moments between them. I could not identify a better option, I said, which was true. She nodded, which meant she understood that this was not the full answer and was choosing not to push for it, because she was, in some ways, considerably more professionally courteous than her rank suggested. I said, at Harova. What actually happened? She was quiet for a moment. They went in short, she said. Less than a company. Dominion had Harova Station and they weren't giving it up. A pause. The math said it wasn't survivable. But, they survived. Most of them. How? She was quiet again. Looking at the gas giant. The bending of it, the long slow sweep of its atmospheric turbulence visible even at this distance if you watched the light change. They stopped trying to win the fight the Dominion was running, she said. And, ran a different one. I thought about this for a long time. What fight? I said. She looked at the gas giant for another moment. Then, she looked at me. The one where you don't die, she said. You'd be surprised how much of the math changes if you start from there. I want to tell you about the 47th page. I wrote 46 pages of incident report. I turned them in. I believed, at the time, that they were complete. I had been thorough. I had documented everything I considered significant. 3 days later, Adeyemi submitted a supplementary incident report through the Joint Operation Administrative Channel. 1 paragraph. Addressed to the record. I read it when it arrived in my queue. Then, I read it again. Then, I put it at the end of the file, and I did not change it, and I did not write any comments in the margin, which is my standard practice for documentation I find arguable. The paragraph read, in its entirety, Commander Varates maintained command authority and operational continuity under conditions that exceeded the design parameters of Vedhani fleet doctrine. Specifically, he held the ceasefire window, he authorized the TBD composite deployment, he stood at the viewport for 20 minutes before the assault and did not leave, and he drank the coffee without being asked. These are not small things. They are the record. I have not discussed this paragraph with Adeyemi. I have considered it several times. She filed it through proper channels, it is now part of the formal record, and I cannot, in good conscience, having reviewed the documentation standards, argue that it is inaccurate. I have thought about the phrase he held the ceasefire window. I have thought about what it means that this is the thing she chose to document. Not the tactics. Not the strategic outcome. The 8 seconds in which I chose not to override. The war ended 40 days after the Vrethus assault, formally, in a signing that I was present for but that I will not describe in detail because others have described it with more appropriate ceremonial attention than I am able to bring to the task. There are humans at the peace table. This is still, on some mornings, not a fact I have fully integrated. They are not at the head of the table. They did not ask to be. Adeyemi was offered a senior advisory position by 3 separate Vedhani fleet admirals, including Tefkaz, who sent her offer in writing with what I am told is an unusual amount of personal language for a formal communication. Adeyemi declined all 3. She is, as far as I can determine from the deployment logs, back in the field. Different corridor. Different operation. Nowak went with her. He sent me a message, personal channel, brief, with his characteristic economy of words, that said, "Thanks for the authorization. The coffee gets better the more you make it." I have made coffee exactly once since receiving this message. It was not better. I think there is something about the practice that I am still doing wrong. I continue to work on it. I said, at the beginning of this account, that the 47th page was a single paragraph written by a human, and that I would not tell you what it said until the end. You have now read it. what I want to say, what I did not know how to say within the formal structure of the report, and so I am saying here, in this final section, in the part of the record that exists outside the categories, is that the paragraph was true. Not tactically true. Not strategically true. True in the way that things are true when they have been observed over time, from a position close enough to see the small things, by someone who makes a point of recording the story correctly. I held the ceasefire window. I have thought, many times, about what I was doing in those 8 seconds. I have tried to reconstruct it as a calculation, probability assessments, risk weighting, anticipated outcome modeling. The tools I have used for 21 years. I cannot reconstruct it as a calculation. What I did in those 8 seconds was not a calculation. It was something else. Something I do not have a word for in my own language, although I have been searching for one, off and on, for the better part of a year. There is a phrase the humans use. I heard Nowak say it once, during the 43 days between Ven 7 and Vrethus, in the context of a minor supply coordination problem that had become unexpectedly complicated. He had been standing at the mess console, not quite looking at anything, and he had said it to no one in particular, in the tone of someone arriving at a conclusion by a route they hadn't planned. Well, it's worth trying. That was it. The full thing. It is worth trying. Not the odds favor action. Not the expected value of the attempt is positive. Not any of the constructions I would use, that I have used, that are all true and useful and completely insufficient for describing what you are actually doing when you hold a ceasefire window for 8 seconds because something in you does not want to be the person who didn't. I have added the phrase to my working vocabulary. I use it when I encounter decisions that my formal analytical tools handle correctly but incompletely. I use it more than I expected to. Tafkaz noticed. She asked me, in a meeting last month, where I had picked up the expression. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she wrote something down, which is her habit when she encounters information she is not going to comment on immediately but intends to keep. I did not ask what she wrote. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be part of the record. The Dominion Captain Grevthalin is part of the peace delegation. He and Adeyemi have not spoken in person. I do not know if they will. The diplomatic process is complex and the channels are formal and neither of them is, in the relevant sense, a diplomat. But he sent a message through the Joint Operational Archive, flagged to the ceasefire record at Ven 7, 3 weeks after the signing. It was 3 sentences. I will not reproduce it in full, partly because it is personal correspondence and partly because I genuinely cannot parse the Dominion grammatical construction well enough to be confident in the translation. But the final sentence, which the translation matrix rendered with a confidence score of 91%, was this: we have been looking for a word in your language for what you did and we think the word is trust, but we are not sure that is the whole of it. I read this to Adeyemi, over communications, because she had asked to know if Grevthalin contacted the archive. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, tell him he's close. I sent the message. I am still thinking about what the rest of the word is. That is, I think, the right place to stop.